On the morning of the 14th of October, 1887, a physician named Dr. Elias Horne arrived at his office on the third floor of the Pennsylvania Hospital on 8th Street in Philadelphia and did not leave it alive. He was 51 years old, in good health by every account his colleagues would later offer, and he had been employed at that institution for 19 years without a single formal complaint filed against him. His office, when the attending staff finally forced the door open that evening, was found in a state that one senior nurse described in her private correspondence as arranged rather than disturbed, as though whoever had been there had not searched, but had instead selected. The drawers of his writing desk were open and empty. His examination ledger, which he maintained with the regularity of a man who believed record-keeping was a form of devotion, was gone. On the surface of the desk, a single sheet of letterhead remained, held flat by a brass weight shaped like an open hand. The letterhead bore 3 lines of writing in Horne's own hand, and then it stopped. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest. The coroner's report was filed the following morning, 18 hours after the body was found, which was not standard procedure at Pennsylvania Hospital. The physician who signed that report was not the institution's regular coroner. He was a man brought in from the Army Medical Corps, whose name does not appear in any subsequent hospital record. If you are finding this story compelling, hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is paying attention. What the official record shows is a man who died at his desk. What the official record does not show is what Elias Horne had been doing in the 6 weeks before that morning, what he had examined, what he had measured, and what he had written in a ledger that was never recovered. To understand the significance of those 6 weeks, it is necessary to understand what was happening in the summer and early autumn of 1887 across a stretch of the Pennsylvania interior, in the farming communities and river towns between the Susquehanna and the Delaware, where the ground had begun to give back things that no one in those towns had put there. The summer of 1887 was the driest in the region's recorded memory. Wells that had served families for 3 generations went dry. Riverbeds dropped low enough to expose stretches of the bottom that had not seen open air in living memory. And in several locations what the receding water revealed could not be easily explained. The earliest documented report comes from a farmer named Abner Kessler, who in late July wrote to the Land Survey Office in Harrisburg to report that the fall of the Brandywine Creek behind his property had uncovered what he described as dressed stonework. He used that phrase specifically, dressed stonework, which indicates that Kessler, a man whose formal education extended no further than the township school, understood the distinction between stone that occurs naturally and stone that has been worked by deliberate human hands. The survey office sent no one. Kessler wrote again in August. The survey office replied that the matter would be looked into in the following spring season. It was not. A second report came from the town of Downingtown in early September, this one from a Methodist minister named Reverend Caleb Marsh, who wrote to the Diocese of Philadelphia, describing a chamber uncovered during the digging of a new drainage channel on the eastern edge of the town cemetery. Marsh's letter is precise. He describes walls of granite fitted without mortar, a ceiling approximately 12 feet above the floor at its highest point, and a doorway whose threshold was cut at a height that he measured himself and recorded as 9 feet and 3 inches. He describes the floor as smooth, as though worn by long use, and he notes that along the interior walls there were markings cut into the stone that he could not identify, and which did not resemble any script or symbol he had encountered in his 30 years of study. Marsh requested that someone from the diocese come to examine the site before the drainage work resumed and the chamber was disturbed. The Diocese of Philadelphia acknowledged his letter. No one came. The drainage work resumed. The chamber was filled in with gravel and sealed over within the week. It was this letter, forwarded to Pennsylvania Hospital by a colleague in the diocese, that first brought the matter to the attention of Elias Horne. Horne's own correspondence, the portion of it that survived, shows that he wrote to Marsh on the 14th of September 1887, requesting the minister's measurements and any sketches he had made of the interior markings. Marsh replied within 4 days. His reply included a hand-drawn rendering of the doorway with its dimensions annotated and 3 pages of symbol transcriptions done in careful pencil on graph paper. Horne's response to those 3 pages is not preserved, but what is preserved is the entry he made in the professional diary that his wife kept after his death. She noted that on the 18th of September he came home late, ate almost nothing, and told her only that he had seen something in a letter that he needed to think about carefully before he spoke of it to anyone. He did not speak of it to her again. What Horne did next was not the action of a man who had dismissed what he read. He applied through the hospital's administrative office for a 2-week research leave, citing personal medical study, and he left Philadelphia on the 22nd of September, 1887, by train toward Chester County. His wife would later tell her sister in a letter that she did not know precisely where he had gone. She knew only that he had packed his examination case, his measuring instruments, and a fresh ledger bound in brown calfskin that he had purchased the week before. He returned on the 5th of October. He did not tell her what he had found. He went directly to his office the following morning and did not come home for dinner. This pattern continued for 9 days. On the 14th of October he was dead. The examination case was found in his office, opened and largely emptied. The measuring instruments were gone. The brown calfskin ledger was gone. What remained inside the case was a single item that the attending staff logged in their incident report and then apparently set aside without further consideration. It was a fragment of bone wrapped in a square of examination cloth and tied with surgical thread. The incident report describes it only as a specimen of unknown origin, approximately 11 inches in length, noted for unusual density and diameter. The fragment was logged into the hospital's pathology storage on the 15th of October, 1887. It remained there, according to the storage register, until the 19th of November of that same year, at which point the register shows a transfer notation. The transfer notation names no receiving institution. It names no physician. It carries only an authorization stamp from the Office of the Surgeon General of the United States Army, and beneath the stamp, in a hand that does not match any other entry in the register, a single word: received. The Surgeon General's office in Washington in 1887 was not a passive administrative body. It had been expanded significantly in the decade following the Civil War, absorbing the records, the personnel, and the institutional reach of the wartime medical apparatus that had processed hundreds of thousands of casualties across 4 years of industrialized conflict. By the 1880s, it maintained active correspondence with civilian hospitals in every major American city and had the authority, under the Army Appropriations Acts of that period, to requisition medical specimens and research materials from civilian institutions without formal judicial process. The transfer of Horne's specimen required no court order. It required only the stamp that appears in the register, and the stamp was enough. The bone fragment left Pennsylvania Hospital and entered a system from which it did not emerge again in any public record. To understand what Horne likely found in Chester County during those 2 weeks in late September, it is necessary to look at what other hands were uncovering in that same stretch of Pennsylvania ground during the same season. The Archaeological Institute of America, which had been formally incorporated in 1879 and maintained active field correspondence across the northeastern states, received in October of 1887 2 separate field reports from independent investigators working in the region. Neither report was published in the Institute's bulletin. Both were retained in the Institute's internal correspondence archive, where they remained until a partial cataloguing effort in the 1950s produced a finding aid that listed their existence without reproducing their content. The content of those reports has never been made fully public. What the finding aid records is their subject matter. Both reports concerned skeletal remains discovered in Chester County, Pennsylvania, in the autumn of 1887. Both reports noted dimensions that the finding aid summarizes in the careful language of a cataloguer who understood what they were describing as significantly exceeding standard anatomical range. If this investigation has your attention, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more to uncover. Your support makes it possible to bring these buried histories to the surface. Horne was a trained anatomist. Before his appointment at Pennsylvania Hospital, he had studied in Edinburgh under Joseph Lister, whose work on antiseptic surgical technique was transforming the practice of medicine across the Western world in those decades. Horne had spent 3 years in Edinburgh examining skeletal collections, learning to read bone the way a geologist reads stone, for age, for stress, for the record of a life inscribed in calcium and density. When he looked at what the Chester County ground had given up, he would have known immediately that what he was examining was not the product of disease, not the distortion of malnutrition or gigantism in its clinical sense, not any pathology that his Edinburgh training had prepared him to name. The bone fragment that ended up in his examination case was 11 inches in length. A standard adult human femur measures between 16 and 18 inches. A fragment of 11 inches, if taken from the mid-shaft of a comparable bone, implies a full length that places the living individual in a category that the anatomical literature of 1887 had no established framework to accommodate. Horne would have known this. The 3 lines he left on his letterhead, the only writing recovered from his desk, read as follows: "The formation is consistent across all examined specimens. The cortical thickness is not pathological. This is not disease." The sentence ends there, the page ends there. Whatever came after those words was removed before the room was found. The question of who removed it is not one the official record answers directly, but the record does contain a shape that, examined carefully, suggests the outline of an answer. In the weeks following Horne's death, 3 things happened in close enough succession that their proximity is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The Army Medical Corps officer who signed the death certificate returned to Washington without filing a supplementary report, which was required under Pennsylvania Hospital's own procedure whenever an external physician assumed coroner's authority on institutional grounds. The hospital's board of directors voted at an emergency session on the 21st of October to seal Horne's office and transfer all remaining contents to administrative storage pending a review that the board's minutes describe as routine inventory. The review is not documented in any subsequent board record, and the Reverend Caleb Marsh of Downingtown, who had sent Horne the letter that began the investigation, wrote one final piece of correspondence in late October of 1887. He wrote to the Diocese of Philadelphia not about the chamber, but to submit his resignation from the ministry. He gave no reason. He moved to a rural address outside Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and does not appear again in any institutional record. He lived another 22 years. He published nothing. He gave no interviews. When he died in 1909, the obituary carried by the Carlisle Evening Sentinel described him as a retired clergyman who had served the Diocese of Philadelphia and who was, in the words of a neighbor quoted in the piece, a man who seemed to have made peace with not speaking about whatever it was that had once troubled him greatly. Pennsylvania Hospital still stands on 8th Street in Philadelphia. The building that housed Horne's third-floor office was renovated in 1923 and again in 1961. The room itself no longer exists in its original configuration. The wall that separated it from the adjacent ward was removed during the 1961 renovation to expand the corridor, and what had been Horne's office became, in the architectural language of the updated floor plan, a transitional space, a hallway, something you pass through without stopping. The pathology storage register that recorded the bone fragments transfer to the Surgeon General's office is held in the hospital's institutional archive. It is available to researchers. The transfer notation is on page 47. The authorization stamp is faded but legible. The word beneath it, received, is written in ink that a conservator who examined the register in 2004 noted was of a different composition than the surrounding entries, suggesting it was added at a later date than the transfer itself. The conservator's note is filed with the register. It has not been acted upon. The Archaeological Institute of America's Internal Correspondence Archive including the 2 Chester County field reports from October of 1887, is held at the Institute's Boston offices. A finding aid exists. A formal access request is required to view the underlying documents. 3 researchers have submitted such requests since the finding aid was published. 2 received no response. 1 received a response stating that the relevant files were undergoing conservation assessment and were temporarily unavailable. That response was issued in 2011. The files remain listed as unavailable. What the camera, if it could travel back, would find in Chester County in the last days of September 1887 is a physician standing alone in a field beside a riverbank, in the particular silence that follows a significant discovery, holding a measuring instrument over something that the ground had decided, after a very long time, to stop concealing. It would find a man who understood precisely what the measurements meant and understood, with equal precision, what would happen if he said so clearly and in public. The 3 lines he left on his desk suggest that he had not yet decided how to say it. They suggest a man still in the process of finding language adequate to a fact that the available language had not been built to contain. The cortical thickness is not pathological. This is not disease. Those words are not the conclusion of an argument. They are the beginning of one that was never allowed to continue. Elias Horne's name does not appear in the standard histories of American medicine. He does not appear in the Dictionary of American Medical Biography. He is not listed among Pennsylvania Hospital's notable physicians in the institutional commemorations published in 1981 for the hospital's 230th anniversary. His 19 years of service are documented in the employment register. His death is recorded in the coroner's file. Between those 2 entries, the institution offers nothing. The ledger he carried into Chester County has not been found. The measuring instruments have not been found. The bone fragment entered the Surgeon General's system in November of 1887 and did not emerge from it. What remains is the storage register, the transfer stamp, the conservator's note about the ink, and 3 sentences on a sheet of letterhead held flat by a brass weight shaped like an open hand. The weight is still in the hospital's archival collection. It is catalogued under Miscellaneous Physician Effects, 1887. No one has claimed it. It sits in a storage box in a climate-controlled room, and it holds nothing down now, but it was the last object his hand touched, and it survived everything that was done to make sure the rest did not. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the investigation. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.